Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. What is it today? The 5th of May 2021. It's 4 o'clock, near enough. That's the sign that we're on. And we are still reading London Belongs to Me, but we are so incredibly close to the end. And it's very sad, really. So, hello to the lovely Julia, to Sean James Cameron, to Audrey Ford, to Zom Coco, to Tracy Strickland Mottram, who is in a cold and rainy Staffordshire. Hello to Sensible Paul, to David Vad, 302 subs. I know we're doing really well, aren't we, on this? Billabong O'Neill, hello to everyone from a rainy, sleet, windy South Holland. Ooh. I was looking for Turbo Stream, then remembered he's on his Turbo Travels. Yes, he's down in Pembrokeshire. And so he'll be watching the reruns. So Turbo, if you're watching, we are thinking of you. And Justine Jones, hello from sunny at the moment, North Somerset. We've had sort of sun on and off and then a bit of rain, and sounds like it's windy again down here in Worthing. Mary and Philip Hammond, hello to you in Bognor. And Lee Lawson just up the road from me. Back on the live readings again. Here she is. Yeah, we've only got 2 of them to go. And Michael White says, noon after. Indeed it is. And we are on chapter 88. What will we do what are we going to do to occupy ourselves at 4 o'clock in the summer? It seems a shame, really, but I think it would be nice to have a bit of a break, take the pressure off, maybe do some readings at a different time. But anyway, so Nigel Sadler, hello to you. Nice to see you there. So this is chapter 88. It's not quite 4 o'clock. I don't like starting just before the hour in case some stragglers come in right at the last minute. Here we go. There we are. It just turned on my PC clock. Who knows if that's right? So, and Mrs. Vizard. If you remember, we were catching up with all of them. Poor woman. For her, they had been difficult, perplexing months, as well as lonely ones. She had made up her mind, unmade it, and made it up again. Not once merely, but a succession of times. The pattern of indecision had looked like being an extended indefinitely right along the entire fabric of her life. There had been no uncertainty in Mrs. Vizard's mind at the outset. When she first learned of Mr. Squale's duplicity, and it seemed now that she never really doubted it, she had been resolved upon revenge. Nothing less than a writ and damages and the creature's dishonoured picture in the papers would satisfy her. During those weeks of mystery, while Mr. Squale's whereabouts was still unknown, she had been in one of hell's leading furies. But when Connie, rosy and mischief, had returned from Chiddingly on that day in May evening to boast that she had done what Mr. Bark's sleuths had failed to do, Mrs. Vizard began to experience her first misgiving. The image, Connie's image, of Mr. Squales as a winkle and herself as a pin had displeased Mrs. Vizard. Was it possible that she had wondered that in going through with this thing, in bearing her poor bleeding heart in the court of law, she was simply appeasing Connie's insatiable appetite for sensation? Was it really her wish to destroy publicly everything that in private had seemed so delicious, so desirable? To sum up, was it ladylike? But ladylike or not, she didn't fancy letting the wretch get away with it. Every time she closed her eyes, if only for a moment, she remembered, could see, as plainly as if the various items were written there, the list of presents that she had showered on him. It was a long list, a list ending with the valets, that had been showered upon himself. As for Mr. Squales, he had practically forgotten Dulcimer Street, practically forgotten. And forgotten Mrs. Vizard, even forgotten what it felt to be hard up. It was really astonishing quite how rapidly the spectre of poverty had receded. Something strange and wonderful had taken place inside him. He was transformed, metamorphosized. The shabby back-room chrysalis was now a pretty full-size sort of butterfly. He was, as a matter of fact, nearly a stone heavier. He had put on 12.5 pounds in just over 3 months. And his wife was delighted with him, absolutely delighted. Admittedly, so far as his mediumship was concerned, this was one of his sabbatical periods. The days and weeks were passing without so much as one psychic flicker through his whole thickening figure. But wasn't this the case with all mediums? Hadn't the great Schneider had his wintry seasons long before his prime? Mr. Squales saw no cause for anxiety. Not yet. And what was so gratifying and so surprising in a man of his temperament was that he had proved himself such an adaptable kind of husband. When Mrs. Squales, after she could stand it no longer, had asked him cautiously if he really was attached to his grey cashmere with the double-breasted waistcoat, the one that Mrs. Vizard had given him for a walking-out suit, he replied simply that he hated the thing. In consequence, he now had, hanging up in his wardrobe, 2 rough country tweeds, a dark blue worsted with an almost indiscernible stripe, and a new dinner jacket. At the moment, however, because it was hot, he was wearing a sports shirt and a pair of flannels. More than once he had reflected on the irony of it, because flannels may mean anything, and unless he had gone to the length of showing people the tailor's label sewn inside the waistband at the back, there was no way of proving that he wasn't still going about in something cheap and nasty off the peg. Not that in present company there was any of that danger. It was one of his wife's tea parties under the big cedar tree on the lawn, and only a certain class of person, the class that didn't know about things like off the peg, who got invited. Mr. Squales always enjoyed these occasions. There was something at once so graceful yet so informal about the whole setting, so essentially English. The prince's plate teapot merged delightfully into the background of the laurel hedges, and the butler's white shirt front, a sparkling shield of pure ivy, added just that touch of the baronial that the scene demanded. The war seemed so very far away. There's a gentleman from London wishes to speak to you, sir. Mr. Squales started. He'd been daydreaming. He hadn't noticed the butler was already close beside him. Too close, in fact. He was practically crowding. I'm wanted on the phone, you mean? Mr. Squales demanded. The butler came even closer. No, sir. He's here in the hall. He says he's got something to deliver. Private. Something private. The butler dropped his voice even lower. He's from solicitors, sir, he explained. And then Mr. Squales remembered. It was something to sign, or something. His wife had warned him about it. She had given him a block of shares in a present, just enough to enable him to vote, and now there was a matter of a waiver. Mr. Squales wondered dimly what was expected of him. He had never wavered before. But presumably, he had told himself, the solicitor's clerk would like to know how to do it. Otherwise, why send him all this way? Show him out here, he said to the butler, and with an easy smile he addressed his wife's guests. Oh, will you forgive me? He asked. Some papers I have to sign. A rather important document. He caught his wife's eye and smiled lovingly. It was quite a nice young man who emerged from the house, even though it had to be admitted that in his black coat and striped trousers he did look oddly out of place, and in such surroundings he was obviously nervous and ill at ease. Mr. Squales noted sympathetically that the young man's shoes were dusty and cracked across the instep. "You are from the lawyers?" he asked. The young man's embarrassment increased. "Mr. Squales?" "Who else?" Mr. Squales replied. "Who else, indeed?" "I have to give you this," the young man answered, feeling inside his coat pocket. But Mr. Squales stopped him. "Not yet. Later. A cup of tea first. A sandwich. You walked?" "Only from the station," the young man answered with a grin. "Not all the way." Mr. Squales ignored the gouchiness of the pleasantry. "We'll run you back in the car afterwards," he said. "Too hot for walking. You take milk or lemon?" Tea, thank you," the young man answered. Mr. Squales smiled. Clearly the youth was impossible, yet, in a way, he felt sorry for him. He rather liked him. He was so crude, so untutored. Mr. Squales could imagine the tale of the sheer magnificence of this tea party that would be unfolding that evening in some tiny villa in Hackney or Turnham Green. And to give him something else to talk about, Mr. Squales fished out his gold cigarette case, a wedding present from his wife, and offered the young man a cigarette. "Turkish or Virginian?" he asked. The young man lit his cigarette and looked about him. "Nice bit of property you've got here," he remarked. This time Mr. Squales shuddered. They had been his own words once. He decided that he didn't like the young man quite so much, after all. Scarcely looking at him, he extended a hand towards him. "Yes, that letter you spoke about," he said. "Hadn't I better have it?" It was a large envelope of the best quality, which was thrust into his hand, and Mr. Squales' fingers tingled as he touched it. He made sure that the guests were watching him, and then he addressed the young man again. "I'll only glance at it now," he said, "and then we'll go inside. This needs taking seriously." He extracted the letter at last and began reading it. His voice died away as it did so. The shade under the cedar tree seemed suddenly to be full of eyes, all of them devouring him. And then he grew oblivious to them. All that he could see on the notepaper, all he could see was the notepaper that he was holding, and at the top ran the words Barks, Barks, Webberburn and Barks Solicitors. And underneath, in the smudged blue ink which is peculiar to solicitors' typewriting, ran the words, "Sir, our client, Mrs. Louise Jane Vizard, instructs us that, whereas you promise to enter into a state of marriage—" Mr. Squales' gaze fled further down the page. "Breach of promise, damages and compensation." His eyes closed and he swayed. And because his eyes were closed, Mr. Squales did not see that his wife had crossed over to him. The first thing that he knew was that the letter had been playfully tweaked out of his hand, and that she was reading it. As soon as he realized what had happened, his poise, his good manners, left him. "Gimme!" he shouted hoarsely. "Give-me!" He tried to snatch the letter, and as he tried to snatch the letter back as he said it, and out of the corner of his eye he saw the young man grinning at him again. But it was too late. Mrs. Squales had seen as much as she had seen. She had seen enough, in fact. There was silence, an awful, unending silence. Mr. Squales glanced over his shoulder in the direction of the house. There was something furtive about it, as though he might still make a dash for it. His wife's hand, however, was on his arm. It was a firm, unshakable kind of hand, and it was digging into him. Her voice, too, when she spoke, was firm and unshakable, just like her hand, and it dug in just as deep. "Would you all please go on?" she asked, turning to the guests. "I'm afraid we must leave you for a moment." Then she addressed her husband. "Come, Rico," she said. "Come and read me your letter." Chapter 89. Mr. Puddy had done himself a bit of good. Simply by keeping on where he was instead of darting about like some points shoppers, he had got something to show for it. The man at the provision counter where Mr. Puddy dealt had known him for a long time, and he respected Mr. Puddy's kind of shopping, patient, contemplative, discriminating. He was the same sort of human being himself, and it was because of this spiritual bond between the two of them that he half closed one eye, rubbed his forefinger expressively along the side of his nose, and from under the counter passed Mr. Puddy a limp, sagging parcel done up in greaseproof paper. Appreciating that any display of emotion was out of place in such transactions of this kind, Mr. Puddy merely slid the little package into his attaché case, inclined his head slightly to show that he understood, and left the shop unhurriedly. Of course, once he was outside, it was altogether different. By then he could afford to be inquisitive. Resting the case up on the lamp-post opposite, he prized open the greaseproof paper and peeped inside. His guess had been right. It was the better part, probably the whole part, of 8 ounces of picnic ham, already sliced, not too thin, and with no more than a halo of white fat all round it. Mr. Puddy closed his eyes for a moment. "Hab," he told himself. "Price hab." Don't know what that means. And at that moment, and at that thought of so much happiness, he closed his eyes for a moment. "If I could oddly lay me hands on some potatoes, there'd be nothing else I should need." It was getting on for 6 o'clock when Mr. Puddy left Dulcimer Street for the tea warehouse, and possibly because of September hot weather, hot, cloudless and holiday-ish, or possibly because he'd picked up half a pound of ripe tomatoes, Mr. Puddy was feeling completely at peace with the world. Admittedly, he still jumped if a motor car backfired or anything like that, but remember what he had been through. During the whole of the Battle of Britain period, he'd practically lived on soda bicarb, and his insides had just been able to get along, and what? His inside just hadn't been able to get along without it. Then, as soon as he got used to the vapour trails of fighters in the daytime, and the German planes coming down so fast on top of each other than the stop press could keep count, he'd taken the better part of a milk of magnesia as well on the He'd taken the better part of a bottle of milk of magnesia as well on the day when 182 were destroyed. Things had started cooking up at night instead, and through the last few days of August, he'd simply Oh, sorry about that. Just so stumbling on my words there. As soon as he got used to the vapour trails of the fighters in the daylight sky and German planes coming down so fast on top of each other that the stop press couldn't keep count, he'd taken the better part of a bottle of milk of magnesia as well on the day when 182 were destroyed. Things had started cooking up at night instead. All through the last few days of August, why do I miss the words out? All through the last few days of August, he'd had simply shocking heartburn. That's the actual words. I keep jumping ahead, and I don't know why I don't see the words. It's very irritating. The night of the 26th of August had been the worst, and he hadn't expected to get through it. Bombs with his number on them were fairly raining down, but here he was on the 7th of September, still alive. Marshal Goering hadn't been able to do it for Mr. Puddy, and even if he weren't exactly smiling, at least he'd got his nerve back, all because of 8 ounces of ham. He was calm and self-possessed again. He didn't tuck into it as soon as he'd hung his hat up. No rushing at it. Anything eaten before midnight was simply by way of a snack. It was 3 a.m. break that counted, and Mr. Puddy had everything ready for it. He put the ham out on a plate with another plate over it, and the tomatoes were in the bag at the side. The ham was still intact. All that he'd allowed himself was a tiny nibble that had been adhering to the paper. His first round of the premises had been entirely uneventful, simply a saunter past sleeping mountains of tea. Even the rats had been quiet tonight, unusually quiet. There wasn't anything to disturb the stillness, and the soundlessness finally began to get on his nerves a little. He might have been somewhere on the moon instead of inside the city. It was so lonely and so muffled up in silence. He was standing by the front door when the sirens began. They were faint at first, a mere flickering disturbance of the atmosphere. But Mr. Puddy heard them all right. He had ears in his stomach, and immediately a large cold patch began to spread right through him. And this was absurd, because sirens, as indistinct as that, hadn't got anything to do with the tea warehouse. Those sirens were keeping the sleepers of Gravesend. Those sirens were warning the sleepers of Gravesend or Dagenham. All the same, as Mr. Puddy sat there listening, his heart was thumping so hard and his breathing was so noisy that he had to hold his breath altogether, simply so that he could listen. Then, before he was ready for it, the next rank of players in this queer nocturnal orchestra had taken up their fiddles. London itself was howling and whining away at him. In the next moment, Mr. Puddy's own personal siren, the one just outside the back entrance, went off. It was so near that it wasn't simply a matter of hearing it. Mr. Puddy was engulfed and surrounded by it. His stomach went up and down with the wailings. Mr. Puddy was the siren. When it stopped, Mr. Puddy went on vibrating for several seconds all by himself. It was at that point that Mr. Puddy was supposed to go up to the sandbagged telephone kiosk on the roof and tell the London Fire Brigade about any incendiaries which might come his way. Right up there, with nothing but chimneys and a stirrup pump and a long-handled shovel for scooping up the things when the Germans had dropped them. And did he go? Have a heart. There were 58 stairs to the roof from where Mr. Puddy was sitting, and even if he'd wanted to perch himself right under the bombs, 58 is an awful lot of stairs. What was more, supposing he had gone, how long would he have to stay there? For all he knew, he might still be up there at breakfast time, a lofty anchorite looking down on the ruins of smoking Babylon. Taking it for granted, that was, that he himself was still all right, and in air raids it isn't safe to take anything for granted, that was why he picked up his big box torch. He had a terror of being left suddenly in the dark, and went down to the underground cubbyhole where the ham was. Not a moment too soon either. This wasn't just a siren raid. Already there was a kind of summer thunder, a rumble in the air, as though the suburbs were being racked by earthquakes. Mr. Puddy didn't wait to hear the drone of planes. What he had heard was quite enough. It was tympanum and double bass of this 10,000 orchestra. "Let's hope it's only reconnaissance," he told himself. "Just one or two planes come over to spy on us." But if it were only one or two, the guns were making an extraordinary fuss of them. Either that or the gunners had lost their nerve and were simply loosing off wildly. Even down there in the basement it was noisy, which just showed what it would have been like if he'd been up on the roof. Mr. Puddy took his steel helmet off the hook and put it on. Then came the kind of sound that Mr. Puddy liked least of all. The guns were going woof, woof in all directions, and there was a kind of hollowness about them. But this last noise was quite different. It was a sort of crump, and it came the wrong way. Instead of coming through the air like all the other disturbances, it rose suddenly out of the ground at Mr. Puddy's feet. It was as though the hard concrete had growled and then kicked him. "That's one," Mr. Puddy told himself. "That isn't reconnaissance, that's the real thing." As he said it, the globe of cold in his stomach expanded and re-iced itself, and with the rapid change of temperature inside of him, Mr. Puddy began sweating. He passed his hand across his forehead. It was sticky, and no wonder, because they were all overhead. Because they were overhead, all right. The cello passage had started, even from there where he was, with the roof and 5 floors above him. Mr. Puddy could hear them, clear and distinct above the general uproar. The throb, throb, throb came through the walls as though bees were swarming. Mr. Puddy tried not to think of that sound. To produce it, the night sky must have been practically solid with planes. But the cellos weren't the worst. Cellos, I don't know what that means. The bar with the flute and the piccolo had now been reached, and it was altogether a new sound. Beginning as not much more than a shrill whistle, it mellowed and rounded and then changed suddenly into a vulgar whoosh. As soon as Mr. Puddy appreciated what it was, that he was really hearing a bomb coming down, he forsook all dignity and crawled underneath the table with the ham still on it. Even before he'd got under it properly, the thing gave a little jump into the air and a lot of dust and cobwebs were dislodged from the ceiling. But that was not all. Even the whoosh hadn't meant that it was Mr. Puddy's bomb, the one with his name on it. It was while he was still down there on all fours, as it were, playing bears with himself under the table, that he suddenly realised that, shut away from everything like that, he mightn't know what was happening until it was too late. Not merely too late to save the building, but too late to save himself. That was how it was that Mr. Puddy came to leave the security of his cubbyhole for the open draughtiness of the basement corridor. And out there, with his helmet on, he felt fairly in the thick of it. All the same, it seemed about the safest place that he could think of, and he remained where he was, remained there until the gunfire had died away again, as though the summer thunderstorm had moved on to another parish, and the bees had ceased their swarming. When it was quite quiet, Mr. Puddy looked at his watch. It showed 1:55. There was just comfortable time for him to nip up onto the top floor, punch the infernal clock machine on the 4th landing, and get back down for his cold ham. and perhaps it was just as well that Mr. Puddy should have decided to put work before eating. Otherwise it might have been 5 minutes, 10, even a quarter of an hour before he smelt the aroma that had now filled the tea warehouse, and by then it would probably have been too late. It was a queer, elusive sort of smell when it first reached him. A long, flickering feeler of fragrance came out and tickled his nostrils, and then went away again. And that was all. There was nothing about it to which you would give a name exactly. It was more the sort of thing that at dawn gets carried on the wind to schooners as they draw near to the Spice Islands. Mr. Puddy stood still and sniffed and sniffed again. But there was nothing unusual about the smell. In the Leaf, tea is always strangely mutable. He had known a sudden change in the weather to be quite sufficient to set a whole floor of lapsang exuding so powerfully that you couldn't go in there without sneezing. Then it reached him again, the fragrance, stronger than before, stronger than he had ever known it, in fact. The whole basement now smelt like an open tea caddy, and there was a roughness about, a harshness that he had never noticed before. It was it wasn't a really nice smell any longer. Somewhere in it there was just the suggestion of an old autumn bonfire. A bonfire? Mr. Puddy gave a brief involuntary belch of sheer terror, and he started to tremble. He shifted from one foot to the other, wondering whether to go on or turn back. It was not an easy decision to make, because if it was anything serious, he naturally didn't want to get caught in the building. On the other hand, if it was nothing to worry about, say someone else's warehouse on fire, he would like to be able to reassure himself. In the end, it was not the smell, but the ham that decided him. He wanted to get the second round over and sit down to his main meal. Mr. Puddy went on. At the top of the stairs, he found the swing doors, and he sniffed again. He was on the right track, all right. It was distinctly nearer by now, and if he just went on quietly as he was going, he ought to catch up with it in about 2 more flights. There was, however, a nasty surprise in wait for him around the next corner. Up to this moment he'd simply been pursuing an unplaceable, tantalising smell. But as he went past the concrete buttress on the stairs, the beam of his torch suddenly encountered something. It was as though in the middle of the air were churned and milky. It was as though the middle air was churned and milky, and the beam itself took on a shape. It became a long white horn, probing the mistiness that lay ahead. Mr. Puddy got as far as the smoke. Not that there was anything very courageous so far. He could see perfectly well along the full length of the first floor corridor, and the smoke wasn't anywhere enough to be what you might call choking. It was simply that atmosphere was slightly tainted. Then the shock came. When he opened the swing doors on the second story, a puff of smoke, real smoke this time, came out at him. But there wasn't much of it. What there was escaped past him up the staircase, and he could see the rows of cases extending in front of him, orderly, peacefully, and unfiery. The second floor was evidently nothing to worry about. False alarm, he reflected. It's somewhere else. The smoke is getting in. The smoke is getting in from outside. Oh, the smoke's getting in from outside. Yes, got it. But the third floor made him wonder. He paused when he got there, and not merely because he was out of breath and his legs were giving way under him. Those last 18 steps seemed to have taken him back to the middle of last September afternoon. He couldn't, for the moment, get himself to go any further. Suppose the building really was on fire. Suppose the raid started up again. Suppose he fainted. On the other hand, he couldn't go back down again just like that, because he was far too jumpy and on edge to be able to eat anything. Just for his own peace of mind, he had to continue, just to make sure. But there was hardly any smoke on the top landing when he reached it. But there was something else. From underneath the door, a brilliant shaft of light, like a searchlight, was streaming, and the air around him was roaring in his ears. When he opened the door and peeped inside, he jumped back, and pretty quickly too. In the furthest corner of the floor, the scootshong floor, oh, that must be a T, scootshong floor, a fire was raging. The smoke was rolling up from it, as though a small volcano had started. And in the tiny glimpse that he got, Mr. Puddy understood now why the smoke hadn't been thicker outside. In the roof over the volcano, a large untidy hole had been scooped out, and there was a straight-up draught like a chimney. Mr. Puddy got back down the 58 stairs faster than he had ever moved before. He had seen quite enough, and he wanted to share it with somebody, with as many people as possible. The telephone he used was the one on the ground floor, just beside the main entrance. He chose that one because it was, well, the furthest from the fire. But it wasn't that far all the same. He understood the banging. He stood there banging the receiver up and down and wondering how long it would take before the flames were lapping around him. The voice at the other end, when at last he got through to the other end, didn't seem in the least surprised when Mr. Puddy announced where he was speaking, that he was speaking from a burning building. On the night of September the 7th, 1940, there were too many burning buildings in London already to get very excited about just one more. As soon as he'd rung off, Mr. Puddy wondered where he should wait until the engine got there. He didn't like stopping where he was because at any moment the floor above might come crashing down on him. Nor did he fancy hanging about outside because a tin hat didn't seem much protection against the sort of things that might start dropping down again at any moment. In the end, he decided on an alcove under the front stairs. And while he sat there, he remembered everything that he should have done, like keeping the blaze under the control with a stirrup pump until the engine arrived, or stuffing up the underneaths of the doors with damp cloths to exclude the draught, and moving inflammable objects away from the blaze as soon as possible. And as he remembered the last, Mr. Puddy laughed, a hollow kind of lonely laugh, because everything around him was inflammable. If he'd tried to do what the handbook said, he would have had to shift the whole blooming warehouse and put it down again on the other side of the river. And in any case, the handbook wasn't all that reliable. If he'd been up there on the roof where he should have been, he wouldn't have been where he is now. The place where the incendiary had come in was exactly where he would have been standing. By the time the firemen arrived, the whole corner of the warehouse was well alight. Simply by pushing the front door ajar and peeping into the night, Mr. Puddy could see the reflection of the flames in the windows opposite. And so far as he personally was concerned, he would have been quite content to leave it at that. But the fire officer wouldn't hear of it. He was a brisk, efficient sort of man and wanted to know everything about the warehouse. He even insisted on Mr. Puddy's going round with him. During the past 20 minutes, things had certainly taken a bad turn. The wind had shifted and the smoke was now curling down the staircase in great wreaths. There was a shrill crackling, like a forest fire, as well as the roar that Mr. Puddy had first heard. Even the third floor was a bit further than Mr. Puddy really cared to go, but he had reckoned without his companion. "You'd better lead now," the fire officer shouted at him through the din. You know the way, and you lead the way, I'll follow." And follow he did, so closely that Mr. Puddy could not possibly turn back. He could feel the fire officer's knee pressing into him. The fourth floor, however, was beyond even the fire officer. Smoke like this needed masks and equipment, and the two of them came back down again, choking. And once he was down, Mr. Puddy remained down. He stood there by the telephone in case he was needed, and he wasn't. The AFS got along perfectly well without him. Mr. Puddy watched, fascinated, while the enormous tape-like bandage of hose was unwound and carried up the staircase, and the young men who followed it carried axes, crowbars, jemmies. Then the fire officer, all blackened and besmirched, like a black minstrel, came down the stairs. I had to say that because there's a word which we can't use anymore. I didn't realise that was in the book, but anyway, came back down the stairs and, pushing Mr. Puddy out of the way, began telephoning. It seemed that the AFS wasn't so efficient after all. The officer was appealing for a fire tower. Mr. Puddy had only just taken up his place again after the officer had finished the call when the top floor gave way. Not all of it, but the northeast corner where the volcano had been. And as it broke, it scattered the ignited cases of Lapsang into the quiet orderliness of the Ceylon Bay. 2 minutes later, despite the water that was cascading down from the top floor, the salons were burning furiously too. The fun, in fact, had really started. Even the fire tower couldn't save the building. The huge giraffe-like thing arrived and immediately went into action like Niagara, and for all the good it did, it may as well have stayed at home. The jet of water heated nearly to boiling point by the flames and spread across the floors with the contents of the broken cases floating down on top of it. Soon the warehouse was swimming in gallon upon gallon of half-brewed tea. Mr. Puddy had left the telephone by now because the position no longer looked healthy. He was over by the bicycle sheds. The air raid really seemed at last to be over, and he was breathing more easily. The only thing that worried him was having to explain to the manager how he'd come to let the warehouse get into such a state. So far as he could judge, there would be only the 4 outside walls left by the morning. The whole incident would almost certainly lead to a row, and of course, a spell of unemployment. And it was while he was thinking these gloomy thoughts that he remembered his ham. Thank God, that was safe. Right down there in the basement, it was probably wasn't even warm. The only danger was that some of the water might have leaked through onto it. And so that he could rescue it before it was too late, Mr. Puddy decided to slip in for a moment through the side door that led straight down into the basement corridor. From the look of the building, he'd cut things pretty fine anyhow. It was stopping to pick up the tomatoes that was Mr. Puddy's mistake. He'd got the plate with the ham already when he tried to balance the tomatoes on top, and in his haste he dropped them. Picking them up again cost him nearly 2 minutes because one of them had burst. And by then the ground floor, rotten for years and now sodden as well by the weight of the water, gave way as well. Admittedly, it was only in one place where it collapsed, but a basement is naturally a confined sort of spot, and a great blast of sparks and smoke rushed in a gust past Mr. Puddy's door. It was like standing to one side while a swarm of fiery bees tore by. Mr. Puddy redropped the plate that he was carrying. He was so frightened now that he ran blindly to get out. The side door was only 25 feet, and he reckoned that full speed he might just reach it holding his breath all the time. He might even have managed it if he hadn't fallen over something. Right in his path, where he couldn't see it because of the smoke, there lay an obstacle. and Mr. Puddy fell headlong. The bulb of his electric torch was broken, and he found himself abandoned in the basement with no light except the big red glow at the far end of the corridor. Mr. Puddy screamed, and at the same moment the obstacle that he was lying on gave out a groan. Mr. Puddy screamed again. It was a man, all right. Mr. Puddy could feel that much, and he was in an AFS uniform. What Mr. Puddy didn't know was how badly hurt the man was, nor did he know that 20 seconds before the thing had tripped him up, had been directing a fire hose 2 floors above and had come through the floor with the boiling water and cinders. The man was unconscious. Mr. Puddy could tell that because the man's arms and legs were moving, particularly the arms. Oh, sorry, the man wasn't unconscious. I'm sorry, I'm so excited by it, I'm misreading it. The man wasn't unconscious. Mr. Puddy could tell that because his arms and legs were moving, particularly the arms. After exploring Mr. Puddy's body, they discovered his neck and fastened themselves to it. Then began the worst 5 minutes in Mr. Puddy's life. He was in the dark, he was trapped in a burning building, and he was being throttled. It was now simply a question of whether death would come first from strangulation or from suffocation from the smoke. When he found he could do nothing to make the man relax his gasp, Mr. Puddy began to crawl. With the other man clinging to him, he groped his way along the corridor as though he was playing bears again. And he was getting on quite nicely when a sudden crash behind him sent up a fresh cascade of sparks and fragments. One of them fell quite near him and lay there glowing like a red-hot coal. Mr. Puddy put on a fresh spurt. Composite and hampered as he was, he scampered. The stairs very nearly beat him. Steep and awkward at the best of times, they rose up like a cliff now that they had to be tackled on his hands and knees. It would have been bad enough if he hadn't got the weight round his neck. As it was, the whole thing was nearly impossible. Twice on the way up the flight he decided to give in and just die there in whatever way men do die in fires. But when at last he did manage to get as far as the door and collapse forward over the low steps, it was worth it. Kind hands took hold of him, and one of the helpers, Mr. Puddy was too far gone to notice which one, poured something down his throat. He learnt afterwards how it was that they were ready for him. Just before he'd gone back for his ham, the fire officer had given the order to evacuate the building. Then it was discovered that one of the firemen were missing, and a volunteer search party was trying to break in to look for him. Nobody had noticed at the time that Mr. Puddy was missing too. He didn't make much difference either way. But when, retriever-like, he suddenly emerged at their feet with his burden, it made the volunteer rescue party look rather silly. As he was carried away by 2 muscular AFS men, Mr. Puddy heard something about his being an example to the entire force. It was the fire officer himself who was saying so. Well, here we go. We're on chapter 90. And there I'm going to leave it, I'm afraid, because the next bit is longer. We don't want to get into that. We need to eke out the rest of this. Sorry, I was stumbling away as ever. Made it. Has it finished yet, Linda Kane says. No, not yet. We still have at least one more, if not 1.5 sessions to go. It was just very dramatic. You've been mentioned in dispatches. Turbo, sneaking in at the back of the Freshwater West. Hello, Turbo. Nice to see you. Pembrokeshire, very windy, dry and sunny. How lovely. I thought my ears were burning. Absolutely. Not only that, but we've had a burning fire. But there you go. Anyway, Mr. Puddy has been hamming it up, but he is alive. He's a hero. He is a hero. Cheers. Right. On that note, I must whiz off and get the fire in the Essie lit. Thank you very much, everybody. It's all gripping at the end. We're all on tenterhooks. But I will catch up with you later. Those of you who are watching the Vobes show will be having a special guest on tonight's show. And I will be back again tomorrow with probably the penultimate. We've got to finish this by Friday. So probably the penultimate. I don't think we'll get through the end, but you never know. Anyway, take care. Have a good afternoon, what's left of it. Hope the weather improves wherever you are. And I will see you then. All the best, and bye for now. Bye-bye.